Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Bill Reavels no way intended to come the axis upon which Ridge's worlds eventually shattered, yet the moment he uncovered Katie's secret platoon-up plan with Eric, the fracture lines that had been still spider-netting through every subcast of reality split open with a silent violence that echoed across confines. Because Bill's discovery wasn't just about treason but about timing. About the precise moment when verity becomes an armament sharper than any blade forged in Ridge's collapsing multiverse, and as he stood alone in the observation becket overlooking the shattered skyline where sky bled into void and metropolises hung like broken studies suspended in murky graveness, he realized that Katie had been playing a longer game than anyone, including Eric, had suspected, weaving alliances beneath false conflicts, orchestrating events so subtly that indeed Ridge himself, the mastermind of worlds, had failed to see how the pieces were aligning, and Bill's mind contended back through the signs he'd dismissed as concurrence, the translated pauses in Katie's transmissions, the way Eric always arrived moments before catastrophe and left with just enough information to stay ahead, the unnatural synchronization of their movements across divergent timelines, all of it suddenly snapping into focus as Bill penetrated the retired subcast of the World Core Archive. A subcast reconciled not to authority or birth but to intent, and there it was, the plan. Not a document but a living algorithm evolving in real time, mapping issues where Ridge's worlds didn't simply survive fracture but were designedly shattered into controllable fractions, each shard easier to rule than a whole, and Katie's name was threaded through it like a palpitation, steady, deliberate, unyielding, while Eric's hand appeared as a counter-rhythm, adaptive and raptorial. And Bill felt commodity inside him riddle out, because this wasn't the hopeless adventure of revolutionists or the arrogance of tyrannizers but commodity colder, commodity nearly merciful in its atrocity, a plan designed to save actuality by breaking it beyond recognition. And as Bill absorbed the full compass of it, he understood why Katie had no way told him, why she had smiled the way she did when he talked about conserving Ridge's original vision. Because she had formally decided that vision was unsalvageable. That Ridge's worlds were too connected, too unpredictable, too dependent on fragile constants that no longer held, and Eric, brilliant, unmoored Eric, had been the only one ruthless enough to help her pull the detector, to turn collapse into strategy, and Bill's breath fogged the glass as the becket quivered, another world earthquake splashing outward as if reality itself tasted it was being bandied like a chessboard, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether discovery itself was an act of violence. Because the moment he knew, the plan replied. Recalibrated, conceded him as a variable, and deep within the algorithm a new branch extended labeled simply Bill_Reavels_response_unknown, which scarified him further than any unequivocal trouble, because it meant Katie had anticipated indeed this, had left room for him not as an supporter or an adversary but as a destabilizing force, a wild card able of accelerating or annihilating the wind-up. And as the lights across the shattered skyline flitted, Bill realized the worlds weren't just shattering because of the plan, they were shattering because knowledge itself was propagating too presto, because formerly one mind saw the pattern, the macrocosm acclimated, and nearly far below, in a sub-reality sutured together from abandoned timelines, Katie and Eric stood together at the confluence point, watching the same fractures from a different angle, Katie's expression calm, bent, haunted, while Eric smiled with that infuriating blend of admiration and expectation. Formerly guessing that Bill had seen it, formerly calculating how Bill's heart, fidelity, and fear would interact, and when Katie eventually spoke, her voice carried not triumph but abdication as she said that Bill would no way forgive her, but he might understand, and understanding, she knew, was the most dangerous form of mercy, because it delayed action. And detention was the one thing their plan couldn't go as Ridge's world screamed quietly into slivers of possibility, each shard drifting further from the others, each one an implicit area, an implicit grave, and Bill, still gaping at the living chart of destruction and deliverance intertwined, felt the terrible weight of choice settle onto him, because revealing the plan would doom billions of realities to chaotic collapse, but stopping it might condemn them to a slower, crueler extermination, and in that suspended moment, between disclosure and response the macrocosm held its breath, staying to see whether Bill Reavels would come the excrescence that shattered Katie's secret ever, or the final, unintentional element that made the shattering complete, because the macrocosm no way truly pauses, it only pretends to vacillate while it decides how important it's willing to lose. And Bill felt that decision pressing down on him as the World Core Archive continued to unfold new prophetic branches like fractures spreading through glass, each one illustrating how Katie's secret platoon-up plan with Eric wasn't simply a contingency but a gospel in stir, a belief that Ridge's worlds had grown too vast, too entangled with one another to survive complete, and that the only path forward was controlled obliteration masquerading as revitalization, a belief that affrighted Bill indeed as he understood its brutal sense, because every model he penetrated verified the same terrible verity junction meant cascading failure, while fragmentation offered survivability at the cost of identity, and Katie had chosen survival without reason, had chosen to become the villain of a story she believed no longer justified icons, and as Bill's fritters quivered over the interface, he saw how Eric's part fit impeccably into that worldview, not as ACO conspirator driven by testament but as a catalyst driven by curiosity, someone who viewed the shattering of worlds as an trial in adaptive dominance, eager to see which fractions would evolve into commodity stronger, commodity good, and it repulsed Bill to realize that Katie knew this and accepted it anyway, because she believed she could steer Eric's chaos long enough to stabilize the fate, could ride the surge of destruction without drowning in it, and that faith, lost or not, was what made the plan so terrifyingly presumptive. And as another earthquake gurgled through the Beckett, Bill's studies fractured backward into memory, recalling the first time Ridge had spoken of the worlds not as homes but as ideas given form, each reality a question asking whether actuality could sustain itself under different rules, and Ridge had always believed in preservation through balance, through careful adaptation rather than force, but Katie had grown up watching that balance fail again and again, watching entire worlds rot sluggishly because no bone was willing to make the unrecoverable choice, and Bill had been there too, had helped patch collapsing timelines, had told himself that every save signified indeed as the costs compounded, and now, faced with a plan that treated loss as a resource, he felt the full weight of his conspiracy in the system Katie was trying to destroy, because her plan didn't crop from nowhere. It surfaced from times of sanctioned concession, from opinions made in quiet apartments where leaders agreed that some worlds could be offered laterally rather than now, and Eric had simply stripped down the pretense, offering Katie the means to end the taradiddle all at formerly, and far below, at the confluence point where realities lapped like translucent scars, Eric watched the data aqueducts flicker with recreation, formerly apprehensive that Bill's access had altered probability overflows, formerly enjoying the fineness of a system that responded to observation like a living thing, and he remarked casually that Bill would struggle, that Bill always plotted when the answer needed atrocity, and Katie said nothing at first, her eyes fixed on a shard realm tearing itself free from the chassis, a world where abysses reversed into sky and metropolises fell overhead into storms of light, because she flashed back that world, flashed back arguing to save it, flashed back Bill standing beside her averring there was still time, and now she wondered whether she had crossed a line or simply conceded it. Because once you decide that worlds can be broken for the lesser good, there's no moral ground left that cannot ultimately be shoveled, and when she eventually spoke, she said that Bill had always believed in people more than systems, and that was why he'd suffer most when he realized systems were each that remained, and as Bill continued to watch the algorithm evolve, he saw the moment he was meant to intermediate, a narrow window where exposing the plan to the remaining wardens could spark a counter-collapse, destabilizing Eric's controlled bumps and forcing Katie to repeal, but that path ended in unbridled shatterstorms ripping through Ridge's worlds without any guiding hand, leaving survivors stranded in hostile fractions with no structure to rebuild, while the indispensable, staying silent, subtly guiding issues, getting an unnoticeable abettor, offered a chance, still slim, to cowgirl the shards into commodity suggesting durability, and Bill's casket tensed as he understood the true nature of Katie's secret, not that she had betrayed him, but that she had trusted him enough to make his choice unsupportable, because she knew he'd find out ultimately, knew he'd stand exactly where he was standing now, forced to decide whether integrity signified further than actuality, and the Beckett's admonitions began to wail as a major nexus destabilized, one of the primary anchors holding Ridge's original world chassis together, and Bill saw Eric's fingerprints each over it, the deliberate overloading of unproductive circles designed to force the shattering to accelerate beyond any attempt to reverse it, and that was when Bill realized Eric was formerly pushing once Katie's projected thresholds, formerly testing how important chaos she'd tolerate before intermediating, because Eric didn't believe in consummations, only escalation, And for the first time since penetrating the plan, Bill felt a swell of clarity. Cut through the dread, because if there was still influence to be set up, it was there, by the growing divergence between Katie's controlled destruction and Eric's appetite for unbounded elaboration, and as the World Core registered another waterfall failure, Bill initiated a silent chopstick in the archive, a move so subtle it slightly registered as defiance, designed not to expose the plan but to exaggerate Eric's destabilizations just enough to force Katie to see the consequences of trusting him, and as the chopstick propagated, Bill felt the unborn cock, not toward deliverance or damnation but toward battle, because now Katie would have to choose whether to rein Eric in or let him burn the chassis briskly than she could manage, and Eric, seeing resistance he could incontinently detect, laughed, pleased by the emergence of a good adversary. Indeed, as Katie's expression darkened with the consummation that Bill was no longer just a variable but an active force. And Ridge's worlds continued to shatter around them, not as an unforeseen catastrophe but as a long, echoing laugh stretched across horizonless realities, each fracture a question with no clean answer, and Bill, standing alone at the heart of it all, eventually accepted that there would be no interpretation of this story where he surfaced unbroken, because once you know how the world ends and how it might be saved, you come responsible for every piece that falls, whether you touch it or not. And responsibility, Bill was learning, was heavier than guilt because guilt could be acquitted by concession while responsibility only multiplied the longer it was carried, and as the silent chopstick he'd introduced into the World Core archive gurgled outward, subtly magnifying Eric's destabilization patterns, the fabric of Ridge's worlds replied like a living organism pushed past its forbearance, not collapsing outright but developing asymmetries, irregular shatter lines that refused to align with Katie's precisely calculated protrusions, and it was in those diversions that the true cost of the secret platoon-up plan began to surface, because worlds were no longer breaking fairly into governable shards but tearing inversely, creating cold-blooded realities sutured together from inharmonious laws of drugs and memory, places where occupants flashed back dying in one interpretation of actuality while continuing to live in another, and Bill watched these imperative anomalies with a sickening blend of horror and admiration, understanding that this was what Eric wanted all along, not order from chaos but novelty from suffering, evidence that actuality could be forced to introduce through pain, and far below, at the confluence point, Katie felt the shift before she could quantify it, felt the plan slipping out of the narrow corridor of issues she had fought so hard to maintain, and when Eric remarked smoothly that the chassis was singing else now, she eventually turned to him with commodity sharp and dangerous in her eyes, because she honored that tone, the exhilaration he could no way completely conceal when effects came changeable, and in that moment she understood Bill's move without demanding evidence, understood that he'd chosen neither exposure nor submission but resistance through imbalance, forcing her hand in a way that imaged the veritably sense she had used to justify the shattering itself, and the irony cut deep. Because Bill had learned her assignment too well, and as admonitions protruded through the confluence station, warning off cross-shard impurity and raw reason circles, Katie was forced to defy the possibility she had refused to admit that Eric could be controlled indefinitely, that the plan's success depended not just on mathematics and strategy but on the restraint of someone unnaturally unable of it, and Eric, seeing the shift in her address, only smiled wider, drinking the pressure as substantiation that the game had eventually come intriguing, and he said, nearly affectionately, that this was always the threat when you tried to domesticate a storm, and Katie's silence in response was more satisfying than any argument, because for the first time since the plan's commencement she was no longer certain she was choosing between two immoralities but between two catastrophes, and Bill, covering the unfolding consequences from the Beckett, felt the strain. Structure toward incurve point, because the diverged data sluice he'd introduced was now feeding back into the primary chassis, creating feedback circles that hovered to expose the plan laterally through anomalous events that indeed the wardens could ignore, and as exigency councils convened across surviving core worlds, Bill realized time had compressed to a cutter's edge, the kind of moment where history accelerates and vacillation becomes indistinguishable from action, and he allowed of Ridge also, not as a god or mastermind but as a defective romanticist who had believed worlds could attend without consuming one another. And Bill wondered whether Ridge would see Katie as a necessary elaboration or a woeful failure, whether he'd condemn Eric outright or fate him as an ineluctable consequence of unbounded creation, And these questions visited Bill as the first of the mongrel shard realities made contact with a stable core world, driving fear, violence, and a flood tide of disagreeing trueness that no authority could attune, because how do you govern a population when half of them flash back a different history, and as reports of these anomalies spread, the moral clarity Bill had formerly hoped for dissolved fully, replaced by the grinding consummation that every available choice now involved mass suffering, and that the plan's secretiveness had formerly failed in the most insidious way possible, not through disclosure but through consequence, and at the confluence point, Katie eventually brazened Eric, criminating him of accelerating destabilizations beyond agreed thresholds, and Eric didn't deny it, rather arguing that her thresholds were arbitrary, that survival demanded trial, that adhering to her interpretation of control was no different from the recession she claimed to oppose, and their argument echoed through lapping realities, each word wobbling with the weight of lives balanced on abstraction, and when Eric suggested that maybe Bill's hindrance proved his point, that unpredictability was the true machine of progress, Katie felt commodity in her fracture, because Bill hadn't acted out of curiosity or ambition but out of care, out of a hopeless attempt to save some remnant of choice in a system designed to exclude it, and that consummation forced her to defy the part of herself she had buried to make the plan possible, the part that still believed people signified further than issues, and as the chassis jiggled again, this time slipping an entire sector of Ridge's worlds into uncharted fragmentation, Katie made a decision that would review the wind-up entirely. Because rather of tensing control or exposing the plan, she diverted critical stabilizers down from Eric's experimental zones and toward the arising mongrel shards, effectively prioritizing the lives formerly caught in the fallout over the theoretical success of the grand design, and Eric, fading the shift incontinently, laughed, not in delight this time, but in unbelief, because by choosing compassion over optimization, Katie had introduced a form of inefficiency he couldn't tolerate, and in doing so had revealed the abecedarian incompatibility between them, and Bill saw this pivot play out in real time, saw the probability angles realign, not toward clean shattering or total collapse but toward a messy, prolonged struggle over the future of the fractions, unborn no longer mandated by a single retired plan but queried openly through action and consequence, and as wardens began to rally, drawn by the inarguable substantiation of systemic sabotage, Bill knew the secret was effectively over, not because it had been confessed but because it had come insolvable to contain, and in that sense, Ridge's worlds were truly shattered, not just physically, but ideologically, because the belief in a singular, coherent fortune had been broken beyond form, and as the Beckett shook under the strain of another cascading failure, Bill eventually initiated his last move, transmitting a precisely curated sluice of data to multiple coalitions contemporaneously, not the full plan but enough verity to help any one group from seizing absolute narrative control, icing that the fate would be shaped by conflict and concession rather than domination, and as he did, he felt a profound prostration settle over him, the kind that comes not from fear but from acceptance, because he understood now that there would be no restoration of what was lost, no return to Ridge's original dream, only the slow, painful work of erecting meaning in the remains, and nearly in the chaos, Katie felt the transmission ripple outward and closed her eyes, knowing Bill had done exactly what she had both stressed and hoped he would, while Eric, watching the same data spread like campfire, eventually lowered, fading that the game had slipped beyond indeed his capacity to prognosticate, and in that moment, amid shattering worlds, collapsing certainties, and the birth of numerous fragile futures, Bill Reavels came what he'd no way wanted. To be not a rescuer or a destroyer, but a substantiation who refused to look down, carrying the knowledge of how close actuality had come to being remade in secret, and how it had rather been broken in the open, where every scrap, every survivor, would now have to decide for themselves what Ridge's worlds were meant to come, knowing that the age of retired plans was over, and that from the remains of shattering, commodity uncertain, queried, and sorrowfully alive would have to rise in its place.